Hello, 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 every fucking beautiful body out there, and welcome, welcome, welcome to the Sex, Drugs, and Jesus podcast. Hallelujah, tabernacle, and motherfucking praise. I have with me today Cheyenne Mihko Kihêw, who is the community liaison for the Edmonton Two-Spirit Society up in Canada. How the fuck you doing today, girlfriend?
I'm doing wonderful. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Hells yeah, this has been a long time coming.
It has.
We out here. And so tell us who you are. I'm super excited, y'all. We're going to be focusing on Native American Indigenous peoples today and getting some head knowledge on what all the different terms are, the struggles, the persecutions of our Native American Indigenous people. I'm part Native American myself. And so, as you can see, you are full blood. And so, tell us who you are and what
Oh, I'm not full blood. No.
you.
No, I'm not full blood. So I'll just introduce myself in my indigenous language. So Tante Kakiano Gumaganak, Cheyenne Mihko Kihêw. I'm a Waskahigan Otsinia. So I said just hello, all my relatives. My name is Cheyenne Mihko Kihêw, or Mihko Kihêw, which is my ceremonial name. It means blood eagle being. And I am from Edmonton, up in Treaty 6 territory in Canada. And I'm not full blood Indigenous, so I'm actually mixed, but I don't know my biological father. And so I have a whole half of my identity that I have no way to relate to. So I'm very focused on my indigeneity for that reason, because there's a cultural background that I'm missing in my life. And so it's really important for me to stay connected to the parts that I am aware of. And so on my mother's side, my maternal side, I am from a tribe called the Woodlands Cree in northern Alberta and Treaty 8 territory, from a reserve called Driftpile Cree Nation. I was born and raised here in Edmonton just due to family stuff and my grandmother raising her children away from the reserve very intentionally. And yeah, so I'm not full blood, but I'm half. Not that, but all of that is blood quantum. Like if you have a drop in you, you're indigenous enough, right?
Yeah, so she said she's a Woodland Cree, not to be confused with Marvel Cree, but
Yeah.
the multi
And they them pronouns. Yeah, they them pronouns.
the multiverse is huge. So you prefer they them.
I do, yeah. And there's like a cultural reason for
What is it? What's the culture?
that. Well, I'm what's broadly known as two-spirit, but within my culture, because two-spirit, we can talk a bit more about the intricacies of it. But two-spirit, from my own understanding and learning my teachings from my nation, I am one of 8 genders. And so that Ikweo, which is part of my name, Mihko Kihêw Ikweo, that means like neither man or woman, but all of the genders in one. And so I use they, them pronouns to honor that my culture and my gender are inherently tied to each other. And it helps me as a way of stepping outside that binary of man and woman, and being a little closer to my cultural roots.
Okay, so then if someone says like how I did a few seconds ago, like, hey girl, is that like wrong?
Well, I really like girl, like when it's like super sassy for me personally. And I can't speak for all like two-spirit people because obviously I'm just one person from one nation. But like for me, I don't mind like a sassy girl, but I loathe being called lady or woman or ma'am or like inherently feminine ones, because I have like the female body. People like impose that on me. And so I will very kind, like politely say, oh, not a girl or not a ma'am, but thank you. But when it's like girlfriend, like that's like sassy enough that I'm cool with that.
Yeah, the gays, we can get away with anything. So she likes her good gay girl. Hey girl. Oh.
And if I'm in ceremony, like that's like the one spot too where I'm like, if an elder who's running the ceremony uses like he him pronouns for me, that's how that person is seeing me in that ceremony, and so then that's okay. I'm okay with that in a ceremonial context within reason.
So when you say ceremony, okay, so is this like the Indian powwows that I used to go to where they've got everything like that? It sounds like you're talking about some high spiritual person who's viewing you in a through like an oracle lens. So what when you say ceremony, what do you mean?
Yeah. So when I'm talking about ceremony, so here in Canada, we don't tend to call ourselves Indians. That's like a very more like American kind of way of speaking of indigeneity. But up here in Canada, our ceremonies, like particularly within my nation, again, I can't speak for all Indigenous people because we're not a monolithic group, right? We all have different teachings and ceremonial practices. But in my teachings, a ceremony would be like, I think, like a sweat lodge. Powwows are ceremonial, but they've also kind of shifted into more of like a social gathering now. Other types of ceremony could be like a sundance ceremony or a pipe ceremony, a fasting ceremony, chicken dance, ghost. There's lots of different kinds of ceremonies.
I know that's right. And we're going to get into lots of different kinds of things. So, y'all heard her mention Two-Spirit Indigenous. She was saying that the Native American is kind of like, an Americanization of the culture here. So Cheyenne is going to break down to us like what Two Spirit means in depth. What we're going to find out because I want to know what in between means, Indigi-queer, and is what the fuck the difference is between Native American versus Indigenous and everything like that. Because I don't want people looking at me fucking crazy when I address them. But before we get into that, I saw an article that came out on LGBTQ Nation, which is a great website to keep up with LGBTQ trends. And they have a term called deculturization. And in the article is talking about basically how education systems are low key whitewashing Native American indigenous children. They get them in there, they're cutting their hairs a different way, the things that they show them and everything like that. They're basically turning the Native American indigenous kids white and doing it undercover and have been getting away with it. What do you think about this?
Yeah, that's a big topic here in Canada right now because we have our own system of education that was imposed on Indigenous children since the 1800s. And that was the Indian residential school system here in Canada. And it was largely based off of the boarding schools that that article that you're talking about highlights. I really recommend folks to go take a look at the article if you're not familiar with the process of deculturalization for students. So here in Canada, the idea was that if you took the children out of their home and put them into a school, you could disrupt cultural continuity. So what that means is you interrupt their learning of their traditional language, their belief systems. You interrupt basically all of that cultural development that they would receive by living with their elders, living with their community. Um, and that process in Canada was really, really, really violent. My own grandparents actually were in the residential school system. They both survived, but not without the long-term impacts of it. So while it also does things like, helps you forget your language or helps you be ashamed of your indigeneity, students were coming out of the schools with like sexual abuse trauma, physical trauma. Some students didn't make it out of the schools alive. And so that's where we're at now in Canada is these schools, they're starting to use ground penetrating radar to look into the schoolyards and finding unmarked graves, like mass unmarked graves, basically. And so, of the, I think it's 136 schools here in Canada, they've only gone through a small portion of them, but many, many, many children are being found. And so, actually, I'm wearing a pin today, this orange pin here. This symbolizes the children who didn't make it home. It symbolizes all of the children who survived. And it's based off of a residential school survivor here in Canada named Phyllis Webstad. And she had gotten brought into the school with her little orange shirt. She was so proud. And they took school took her shirt from her and took away her pride and her dignity and replaced it with trauma. And so I do believe that that process of deculturalization is happening in the schools. And we say a lot now, like in Canada, the last school closed in 1996. But the process is still ongoing because you're seeing Indigenous students face higher rates of bullying and suicide within schools than their non-Indigenous counterparts. And if you add the like complexity of being queer on top of it, you're queer and Indigenous, you're like, you're just having like harder outcomes basically. So I think education is used as a way of really separating our students from their belief systems, and it's problematic to say the least. Because as Two-Spirit people, we're still trying to come back from the erasure that happened within Canada, the residential school system moving here. So it's a hard topic to talk about, but yeah, apologies if I'm going to cough. I am still recovering from COVID, so.
Honey, I'm glad you're alive so I appreciate your boldness and your willingness to talk about this difficult subject. I want to dig deeper into the deaths of these children. So let me be clear. So the kids are showing up at school. Are they getting murdered at the school or were they murdered somewhere else and they dumped the bodies at the school?
So historically, the children were actually forced to leave their homes. There wasn't an option. So the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, would come to the homes, take the children, and bring them to the school. If the parents weren't going to give the children up, then the parents were imprisoned and the children were brought to school. So many children died trying to escape the schools, trying to cross through Canadian terrain, which is obviously in winter quite cold and harsh. And so his children died that way. But many children died in the schools at the hands of the priests and the nuns that were often running the schools. So Catholic Church, other denominations were running these schools across Canada. And that was basically who was incurring the abuse onto the children. But there was also another level where the Canadian government authorized experimentation, medical experimentation on the students in the schools as well. So some students were being starved, other students were having their nutrients kind of like being toyed with so that they could figure out how different nutrients impact the body. And they did that on the students in the schools. So some students died just of simply malnutrition, not being fed enough, or the conditions in the schools were quite terrible as well, like quite deplorable, very drafty, no weather protection. And the nurse, the nuns and the priests, they were taken care of, but the children, yeah. And a lot of sexual abuse too. And there's a lot of stories of priests impregnating young women in the schools and then the babies being taken and burned in furnaces. So those are bodies that will never recover. But some of the bodies are marked, like some of the graves are known. You can find them in records, but a lot of the bodies are not written or documented anywhere. And there are residential school survivors who never saw their families come out of the schools or saw their families die in the schools and know that their bodies will never be found. So it's, a lot of it was at the hands of the people who were running the schools.
I really hate the Catholic Church.
It's yeah, it's a hard thing.
I I I don't really hate very many things in this life, but the destruction that churches, denominations, religions cause is just loathsome. It's detestable. It's one of the things that I cry out to God. I cry out against churches and denominations. I pray about this, all the time, because who else can really do anything about an organization, say, as large as Catholic Church or mega churches? So I pray to God specifically for him to do something about these churches and these preachers that have gone buck damn wild, drunk with power. They have no accountability. They fear nothing. And I suppose they think because they have a lot of money or whatever the case may be. Don't know. But that's that bullshit right there. It really, really pisses me off. These priests, nuns, I don't tell you the mega churches again, we're supposed to even go to these people for a sense of security and help, and everything is supposed to be all right. If it's wrong everywhere else in the world, it's supposed to be right when we're in the house of the Lord or in front of somebody who's supposedly his representative or ambassador, not getting raped, beat, starved, down here kicked out of church for not being straight or fired from volunteering for not being straight. The way churches just handle people. I don't attack churches for like having money and stuff like that. Everyone else is already doing that. I don't want to turn into the guy who's trying to control them, which is the problem I have with them is the way they want to control other people. So if you want to make money, if people are silly enough to sit there and give it to you and keep buying your books, your regurgitated sermons and all of that, okay, that's you grown, you selling something to another grown person, that's on y'all. With the abuse of the people, the trying to conversion therapy, people trying to make people change to be accepted and all of that is what I go after the church for. It's the way they treat people. And that bullshit right there, what you're talking about is absolutely terrible. How many years back are these bodies being found? How long ago was this?
Well, the first school was in the 1800s. The ground penetrating radar, that was just over a year ago that they started doing this. So the first school was, I don't know the exact date, I apologize.
Okay.
But yeah, it was just last year that they did the first school. And then now there's just funding happening for all of these different smaller nations to also start the process. But the last school closed in 1996. I was already like 10 years old at that point. Right? Like, I was alive. If I would have grown up on the reserve, I could have gone to a residential school. I have friends who went to residential schools or went to day schools, right? A lot of the elders that we work with went through this processes as well. So It's fresh. It's like you think it's from the 1800s, but it's really not. Like it's fresh in our minds and our hearts.
So these schools were on the reservation, they were not public schools.
They they weren't public. Some of them were day schools on the reserve where students just went in for the day and came back out, but the majority of the schools were on the reserve or near the reserve. Sometimes they would be multiple reserves attending one school. And like the earlier schools that were developed, it's not like how Canada is now, where we're quite colonized at this point. So there's a lot of settlements all over the country, right? But at that point, Canada was largely empty land, right? So the schools would be between reserves or settlements. Yeah, and like they weren't necessarily public, like for I'm not aware of non-Indigenous students attending the schools unless they were inherently related to the church or the people running the schools.
So then I'm curious, so there was Catholic influence there. What history how is the Catholic Church and Native American indigenous people intertwined in the first place?
Yeah, well, because the government was working directly with the church, right? So the government developed a document in 1876 called the Indian Act, and the Indian Act is still in progress today. We're still guided by this policy, and it basically the Canadian government gave themselves authority over Indigenous peoples. So it determines that Indigenous peoples are clearly incompetent of taking care of themselves. They're uncolonized. They're uncivilized. We need to eradicate them. Basically, they wanted to kill the savages. There's like documentation from the earlier government of how they wanted to do this. And part of that process was in collaboration with the church. So having the church run these schools was a way of removing the government, right? They're not there having to provide more staff, but also that indoctrination process, right? Because the Canadian government at that time was coming from Europe. And so a lot of what they did was based around their religion, very, very Eurocentric religious kind of ideologies that were running these political movements. And so that's kind of how it got intertwined. And there's like a really contentious history now with Indigenous people and the church because the church ran these schools for so long. And so people like my grandmother, while she was alive, I couldn't get her to go to a pipe ceremony with me. We didn't go to sweat lodges. She went to church. Like she went to church religiously. She was in church every Sunday. I sang in the choir for like a few years before I realized, what am I doing here? Like, this isn't for me. And I miss my grandmother. I love my grandmother, but I basically had to recently stop celebrating anything tied to religion holidays. Like, I don't do Christmas, I don't do Easter. If it's tied to a religion, I'm not interested. And that's a way of me honoring my grandmother because she was so religious. But that was like that cultural indoctrination, right? The religious indoctrination that she experienced from being in the schools for 12 years, right? And she didn't talk about the abuse or the violence, but we experienced it in our family. It was passed on to us. So I think that's why the religion aspect is tied to us. A lot of our Indigenous people still honor religion in a way that makes sense for them. And that's up to them. We can't say you shouldn't do that because the church did this, right? It's a, autonomous decision. But for me personally, as an Indigenous person, I don't see how I could honestly honor a religion that caused so much harm in my family that I'm still feeling the effects of, that my generations beyond me will still continue to feel.
So wait, I'm a little confused. So you're telling me she was an avid churchgoer, but she was abused by the church. I don't get that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's how deep some of that trauma is. That's how deep some of that pain is. Like, and like I say, her experiences in the schools, she wouldn't talk about. She adamantly, the only thing she talked about was the babies being thrown in the furnace, basically.
But if her pain that came from the religious people, why would she still go to the religious places?
I wish she was alive so I could ask her, because that's something I've been struggling with my whole life. I don't understand how people who have this experience in their families can turn to the church for comfort or for kindness. And a lot of Indigenous people who celebrate in religion will like very adamantly speak up about it. Like, they are very much, we had and I had an experience with an individual recently who works for a very well-known organization for a group called the Métis, which is a group of Indigenous peoples here in Canada. And at one point, this individual said, I'm not Two Spirit. I believe in God. I don't go to ceremony. And he was like in a space full of Two Spirit people. And we were like, what is happening right now? Like, I wish I had the answer to that. I don't know. And I think that just goes to how deep some of that internalization and that shame of being Indigenous really goes, that comes from having those experiences that you do in the school.
You know what? At the end of the damn day, All we need is God. I believe in the Trinity. I'm not naive. I know not everybody's going to believe in God, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Ghost, and I don't really care. But I can only say about me. And I don't think anyone's less than me, or that they're going to burn up and go to hell or anything like that, or they don't believe like I believe. We just believe differently. End of story. Done. I say it all the time. I love hanging out at the Buddhist temple because I like being around other bald bitches like me. It's fucking great. And so they had great vegetarian food. So I fuck stuff and everything like that, but I'm clear on what I stand for. They don't try to make me worship that big ass Buddha statue they have in the temple, that I don't have to bow to it or anything like that. It's a very comfortable space and they don't judge me. I don't judge them. We just share thoughts. And so but at the end of the day, I feel like only thing I need is God. My personal relationship with him when I die and everything like that is just going to be him. There's not going to be a church to stand before the judgment throne with me. There's not going to be a dogma or a doctrine or a choir, at least not an earthly choir, you know, or anything like that. You know, the one of the main pillars of my ministry, Cheyenne, is to get people off of this church and religion and pastor, preacher, worship leader conference going, book buying addiction that people have to these organizations and things like that. A lot of it is rooted in fear. They feel like they don't go to church, they're going to burn up and go to hell. And so then I challenge people, where did you get this belief from? Who told you that? The person who wants you to keep coming to church. So, I encourage people to do their own research across religions, especially the Hebrew Bible, to learn how to read the original languages. I'm getting ready to do a show and I'm gonna get really deep into exactly who in the fuck interprets the Bible, and things like
Men, white men.
exactly fucking one in it. And I'm like the masses are not represented. And so I don't blame you for saying fuck Christmas, fuck Easter. Christmas is just a greedy ass holiday. Fucking Easter bunnies and chicken eggs. What the hell does that have to do with anything? And so I don't feel like we should have to have a holiday to remind us to worship Christ or to remind us of his sacrifice. It's better than nothing. And thank God for the people who only go to church on Christmas and Easter. For fuck's sake, it's better than nothing. Well, you know, it's only been one time in my life that I have been to someone's house when this is when I was in the military and I wasn't able to come home for leave. I think it was Thanksgiving where the family who was running us actually went around the table and acknowledged the reason for the holiday and gave us a chance to express gratitude. Everywhere else I've been, no matter whose house it's been, Labor Day, Memorial Day, 4th of July, Christmas, Easter, New Year's, whatever. It's just food, alcohol, whatever. Nobody ever stops to pray for the veterans who died to give you the holiday, to say a prayer to Jesus or nothing. It's just consuming and consumption and more greed. And I don't sound bitter because this is the truth. And as I'm saying this, how many holidays, festivals, people who are listening, when you go for Labor Day weekend, 4th of July, things that are centered around veterans dying, so that you can have the holiday, when do you ever give thanks to the veterans, the people who have died? When do you pray for the people who are in the military, anything like that? Do you donate to the veteran service organizations, the disabled American veterans, the DAV, or the American Legion? What do you do on veteran holidays besides get fucked up?
Mhm.
And so-
You give thanks on Thanksgiving to the Indigenous people who lost their lives so that you could have the land that you're on now, right? Like, I know the Thanksgiving is another one. Again, our Thanksgiving here in Canada is a little different because ours isn't centered around pilgrims and all of that. Ours is centered around the harvest. And so we're giving thanks to the land, the abundance that we're getting from the land. Whereas I think your Thanksgiving is based on cultural genocide, right? So it's a bit of a different. I know there's a big push now for Thanksgiving to be shifted into, or I think more Columbus Day as well as the other one. Both of those holidays I think are quite contentious in your part. Not so much here in Canada, but the two often get quite confused, right? There was no border prior to colonization, right? And I guess that's where the American thing comes from. Yeah.
so, yeah, so they're starting to call Thanksgiving Friendsgiving down here instead of Thanksgiving. I want to say maybe Joe Biden started that or something, our current president. Don't quote me on that, but I think something like that may have come out of the White House. But it's Friendsgiving now, so we're not even calling it Thanksgiving anymore. It's over. It's done with. and you have fuck Columbus. Y'all don't have a fuck Columbus attitude up
We
there?
don't have a Columbus Day. No, we
Oh,
don't. We
you
don't.
don't have any shit at all. Okay, you
We have other like leaders, more of the political side of things as opposed to like the explorers. So one of the big like fuck you people right now is John A. Macdonald. Like fuck that guy. He was Canada's first prime minister, and he was the one who signed a lot of those documents that took the children from their home, that forced Indigenous people to live this whole new way of being and knowing, right? So yeah, fuck that guy. Like, and Ryerson, that's another one. Fuck that guy too. They recently had an event in Toronto, and they went to the Ryerson University and they took his fucking head off the statue. And that statue head now lives in an Indigenous land camp where they're fighting for their land. Yeah, it's interesting times here in Canada, but yeah, we've got different leaders that were like, no, fuck that guy. That guy sucks. Like, why are we honoring John A. Macdonald? Like, that guy's a douchebag. He's the OG douchebag. Like,
the OG douchebag. That's not a title we want.
no, I think I'll pass on that title.
So colonization is something you mentioned. So that's basically like our deculturization, the way they're trying to turn the indigenous and Native American kids white low key is colonization. It's the same thing, right?
Yeah, I would say like deculturalization is like a process of decolonization, right? It's like it's a piece of the whole or colonization process, if that makes sense.
So have you heard of replacement theory yet?
I don't think so.
There's something that's happening down here right now. I'm gonna since we're talking about the evil shit white people do right now, this it fits into the conversation. I wasn't gonna bring this up, but we just had a shooting down here like in the last couple of days. I want to say maybe Buffalo, New York, or something like that. This fucking white kid went took his ass online and researched places where black people are known to be, and he took his time. They were saying on the Morning Joe show on MSNBC this morning that he went the day before to like this school or mall or church or whatever it was to case the place, and he went there a few hours before the shooting, and then I think he took out like 10 people. I think he killed like 10 people or something like that. And that's an ongoing story. But, this is a white person, and he read the manifestos of previous serial mass shooting people and stuff like that before. So what's going on down here in the United States is we have all of these white people who feel like they're fearing that they're going to be replaced by everything that's not white. And so this whole replacement theory is that us non-white people should be eliminated and the white people should take over. But what do you think about that? Because replacement
Jeez.
theory is a thing and it's happening now.
Yeah, that my heart goes out to all the people that were impacted by that. That is just so sad. It's replaced like that. It's just so ridiculous. Like, there are a lot of white people in the world. White people have the monopoly on like so much, I just, yeah, it honestly blew my mind that people, I wonder how somebody gets to that point. And I have empathy for that person in that he is so wrapped up in this delusion that's like basically just guided by racism, right? Like, just call it what it is. It's a hate crime. He was a white guy intentionally targeting a black community, right? Like, if you're that deluded about skin color or like melanin, like you just have more melanin in your skin than him. Like, I don't understand. Yeah, I honestly, I'm a little out of words for that one because it's just so out there. Like replacement theory, it feels like it's a direct attack on critical race theory, right? Like, it's like almost like the extremist alternative to critical race theory, but it's like obviously going in the wrong direction.
Well, the Republicans are behind that sort of thing, even though they don't want to say it. Because that same guy who went and shot up all these people, like I think a year ago, he was in a mental health institution for a reason, and there is a law that they could have used to prevent him from buying a gun, and they didn't do it. So he had a legally purchased gun that he modified using some tools from his dad's shed. But the point is, somebody who is a mental health patient was allowed to legally purchase a gun who has now killed people. And see, the white Republicans here don't want strict gun laws. Y-
Right. That's a whole other conversation. We could do a whole podcast on just that.
So y'all don't
Yeah.
have like Democrats and Republicans in Canada. What do you have?
We have like liberals and conservatives, which is like basically the same thing. Like a lot of our leaders have, modeled off of American Republicans. The province that I live in, Alberta, we have a premier. His name is Jason Kenney. And this is me taking off my work hat and putting on just my own personal hat because it's nonpartisan. Jason Kenney is also a douchebag and he doesn't really care about much of anybody. So his handling of the pandemic has been terrible. The way he honors, he's just a very fake kind of person, but he's like very much like a mini Stephen Harper, who was a prime minister here in Canada for many years, very conservative. And that individual is very in with a lot of the Republicans in the States. So, a lot of our laws here, we're really curious about what's going to happen with the overturning of the Roe, because that could also trickle up here in Canada. A lot of what happens in the States is impacted in Canada. And you wouldn't think, but again, borders are imaginary, right? And Canadians aren't that far removed from American politics, unfortunately.
Oh, for fuck's sake. You know, I think about this, Cheyenne, so much, the way white people greet people of every race, but it seems to be heavily white, you know, because the rest of us, we're not coming from generations of wealth and shit like that, so we're not so comfortable that we have time to go fucking with other people. We're still trying to keep our own shit together. This is a comfort and luxury that's typical for like white people. They've been financially comfortable so long, medically taken care of, accepted everywhere they go. So they have time to try to attack other people and take them down. When you're trying to build up yourself, your family, your energy is going towards self improvement, not towards trying to tell a woman what to do with her body or not trying to tell people they can or can't get married. We don't have the time. We're too busy trying to survive and come up ourselves.
Yeah, we're just trying to survive, literally. Like,
But in the grand scheme of eternity, you know, the Lord said, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and to lose his soul? These people act like that judgment day is never going to come for them or is not going to come at all. Maybe they can build a colony on Mars and skip out on the return of Jesus, to kind of watch it from afar or whatever the fuck they think they're going to be able to do with all these space missions and shit. But the way they act, it has no eternity in the scope, in the perspective. There isn't no eternity. You can't treat people the way these white people treat people and think you're going to die and have a peaceful afterlife. So it's short-sighted. If I was the devil, I would totally try to trick people into being racist and misogynist and hateful in any way, shape, or form, and to get them to focus on the things of this life. You have rich people who are stepping on people to get even richer. Well, bitch, you can already buy whatever you want. Why the fuck do you want more money, even if you have to hurt people to get it? It's short sighted. So you might get all of that here, and you die, and you be like the rich guy in the Bible, who turned away the people, and then he died and went to hell. What is the point? You can't take it with you. Why so much struggling in this life on things that are going to be temporary anyway?
yeah. And so much disregard for the humanity and in your peers around you, right? Like, at some point, money just overrides so much common sense. It's ridiculous. Yay, capitalism.
It's just foolish. It testifies against them because they already have it, you know? And then I'm gonna say this about the mega churches, and then we will get into the definitions of things. In the book of Jeremiah, it um it speaks about how let me see. Specifically, I can't think of the damn chapter. It's like Jeremiah 21 or 22. It talks about how God is angry with pastors who dismiss people or who just keep on plodding along with their success. And if they lose a member or a sheep or, they hurt people and they don't go to try to make it right. you know, just treat them as collateral damage, it's just a part of doing business. You can't save everyone. But the Lord is not that way. He wants you to stop the whole flock to go and get that one lost sheep, not just keep on trucking along, writing more books and more sermons and selling more music, more worship albums and all the stuff that they do and more tapes and expanding your media empire and getting richer. But, you have churches that cause damage to people They don't apologize for it. They don't do anything to make it right, and that is not okay.
Well, we just got an apology from the Pope. I don't know if you followed that. So there was a group of delegates, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So those are our three like overarching Indigenous groups here in Canada: First Nation, Métis, and Inuit. And then there's different subgroups within those. It's complicated. There's lots of Indigenous people. Anyways, we had delegates go to the Vatican recently. It was all over the news where they basically were going to bring their stories to the Pope. It was like kind of silly. Canada has a big history of apologizing for things that they do. You know, they've apologized for many things over the years, the residential schools and all sorts of stuff. But these delegates were hoping to have, you know, some recognition, not only from the Pope, like not only an apology, but the Pope and the Vatican are holding on to documents, and those are what we were hoping to get, was these documents, as well as all of the ceremonial items that were taken from Indigenous people when our ceremonies were illegal here in Canada, which was for many years. And so none of those items that were stolen were returned. The documents weren't released, but the Pope did make an apology. But if you read the apology, the language that he used was very specific. He doesn't apologize for the church's involvement. He apologizes for certain individuals' activities. And that is a cop out because it's a way of absolving the entire church, including himself as the Pope, from what happened here in Canada. So apologies are one thing, but like we need action, right? Like, why isn't the Pope here in Canada? And he's supposed to be making a trip actually in the coming, I think, year. He's supposed to be stopping here in Edmonton, but why isn't he going to these graveyards, right? Why isn't he going to these quote unquote schools? We're calling them schools, but they're like concentration camps. Why isn't he going to these grounds and seeing the bodies in the graves? Why isn't he helping dig? Do you know what I mean? Like he's never going to do that because he's a million years old. But that's besides the point, is that we got this like apology, but even the apology itself is so convoluted. If from a linguistic perspective, if you break apart the apology, it doesn't mean anything. It's nothing. It's nothing. So yeah. And there was a specific like around Two-Spirit people, like where's the apology for us in particular, right? Because there's a bit of a different impact for Two-Spirit people specifically here in Canada.
The Pope can go fuck himself. Like I literally don't give a damn about the Pope, the Catholic Church, and none of that I idol worshiping, convoluted, religiously diluted, and watered down crock of shit that the Catholic Church is. You know, just I mean, their amount of like angel worship and stuff like that is just okay. You know, the Hebrew Bible tells us not to pray to angels, and when angels would come, there's only two names of angels in the typical recorded Bible, and that's Michael and Gabriel. The other angels did not give their names. And so I don't know where these people get all these angels' names from and everything like that. And they're praying all these saints. I mean, offering prayers up to everyone but God. And I'm all like, okay, that the okay. Jesus said, "Pray to him and him alone, not the Virgin Mary, not Saint Jude, not Felicia or Tron or Kendrick or whoever else you you think that you fucking dead." You know? So
Yeah, when I pray, I always say I pray to my ancestors. I pray to the creator as well, but I don't really know who created me or what that is. But I have ancestors and I know that they were real and I know that they lived because I'm here and I'm alive. And so that's who I pray to because they're still there guiding me and supporting me and loving me. Yeah, I think prayer can be a very like personal thing, right? And you're right. Like a lot of times it is watered down. Do your prayers before bed. Like, what does that even mean? Or where's the intention, right?
well, you know, and I agree with what you're saying. I get from a Native American perspective, it reminds me of a lot of how it is in Asia, you know, where they pray to their ancestors. Do what you got to do. But I'm saying if you're going to claim a division of Christianity and tie it directly to the Trinity, and the Trinity has told you to pray to no one but the Father, then you're doing wrong. You know, what you're doing is not Christian strictly. And the religions I'm talking about in in the East and Asia are not, you know, Christian specifically, like say at the Buddhist temple, when I go there, they have like a whole altar and everything to the ancestors and stuff. Okay, pray to your ancestors, but you're not claiming to follow Jesus Christ in the first place. I would say if you're going to follow him, they act like that's who you're following. But the Catholic Church is a whole hodgepodge. The whole the all the fucking rules they have. I'm all like, who in the fuck came up with this? And so, and from one pope to the next, shit changes with a wave of his hand. I'm all like, and each one of them is supposed to be infallible or whatever the fuck. I don't know. Go to HBO Max, Jude Law's sexy ass. There's a series on there called The Young Pope and the New Pope.
Okay.
It is interesting as fuck. And everybody, all the nuns and the Pope, they're smoking cigarettes and shit, and people fucking everything. And they're really telling you what life is like behind the Vatican and in the Vatican and the political scandals and the bullshit and the secrets and the priests fucking the altar boys and everything like that.
Yeah.
It's all in there. That shit is good.
I'm gonna watch it.
Okay. So tell us, Two-Spirit, you've talked about it. We're going to go through the definitions. Define Two-Spirit. Go.
I can't. So with the word two-spirit, the idea of being two-spirit is that it is generally an Indigenous person who is part of, like, who is gender or sexually diverse. And so the term two-spirit actually is really just a placeholder term. It was developed it actually came to an elder. Her name is Myra Laramie, and she had a pipe vision. So she was in a ceremony lifting a pipe and, saying her prayers, whoever she prays to, I don't know. But in her prayers, she, was asking for some guidance because she was starting to do this work with Indigenous, queer, and trans people and being like, how can we unite us? Because the impacts from residential schools meant that our community was really divided. A lot of folks were like, internalized homophobia, internalized transphobia. So it was a very underground movement. And there was just, they needed more. And so she received this word. It's an Anishinaabe word, and it's Nish Money Doag, and that's literal translation is two-spirit. So she brought this. That was in 1996, and she brought that term to, or 1990, sorry, I'm getting my dates wrong. Anyways, she brought it to the Native American Gay and Lesbian Conference. It was their third annual one in Winnipeg, and there was a number of queer and trans Indigenous leaders who I look up to now as a two-spirit person, but folks like Barbara Bruce, Beverly Little Thunder, and Albert McLeod. And these individuals gathered at the conference were like, we need a term that helps us to unify ourselves. It is a term that folks can use while they're reconnecting to their own Indigenous languages. And it's like basically something that is there for the youth, right? Like, what can we do? And she said, well, I had this pipe ceremony, like I had this vision, and Nishmani Doag is the word that came to me. And so they kind of decided as a group that this would be a term that they would start using, recognizing that really what we want folks to do is reconnect to their own Indigenous language, because that's where you start to get into the complexities of what it means to be two-spirit within your own cultural identity. So when I say that I can't define it, it's because my teachings as a Cree person are going to be different as somebody who's Dene, Stone, Sioux, Navajo, right? Like, so what being two-spirit means to me comes within my own cultural definition. And so that's going to look differently to different people in different nations. And it really depends on how far into your journey you are, how connected you are to your community, your cultures, your teachings, but also recognizing that a lot of these teachings have been impacted by the residential school system, by the church, right? And so you have teachings that even seep into our ceremonies now, right? And that's a whole other, we can get into that topic, but so that's kind of how the term two-spirit was developed. And it's, that Native American Gay and Lesbian Conference is still happening. They're going to have the 35th annual conference this year, and it's now called the International Two-Spirit Gathering. And we hosted it, the Edmonton Two-Spirit Society hosted it last year. So it was really nice to be part of that little piece of history. There's also a lot of roots within HIV advocacy that group was originally doing back in the 90s. And so, yeah, it's been a bit of a journey, but really there was a term that was being used because when the settlers arrived, there was a really negative term, and it's called burdosh. And that was a term that was imposed on any gender or sexually diverse person. And it was used as as a slur. So they were like, how do we get away from this damn slur? How do we get a word that's going to empower us and support the growth of our community? So that's kind of where two-spirit comes from.
Oh shit.
I know. Even just that one question alone, girl. Good luck.
I wasn't expecting all of that, but maybe you let me have it, and that's what I'm here for. Y'all. So when you say this lady who received the term two spirit in a vision was raising pipe, are you telling me she was smoking and getting high or something? Was she smoking out of the pipe? Is that what it meant?
Yeah, we don't like throw like PCP or whatever in our pipes. Like again, I don't know what she does in her culture. She might use drugs in her ceremonies. I don't know, but generally, a pipe ceremony, a pipe is a sacred piece, and tobacco is a medicine in our culture. And so when we put the tobacco into the pipe, we're communicating with creator, we're communicating with our ancestors, we're setting an intention in the circle, and anybody that's in that circle, you're unified together, and it's really just a way of bringing your prayers up and out. And as you smoke, you're inhaling that medicine. And you don't have to inhale, you can just hold the pipe to your heart or to your head. But it's just the process of being in a circle with each other, in a ceremony with each other, is really important.
That sounds interesting.
Hmm.
Sounds very sincere. Has a very sincere spirit about it. So you hear people like how Cheyenne's talking about the LGBTQIA2S conferences and things like that. I don't, there may come a time, I guess some conservative people might listen to my show. This is not a conservative show by any stretch of the fucking imagination, not even in the least, but it is open to people who might be interested in alternative perspectives other than their own. So you see, not everything about the gay culture is whatever it is that's bad about us that they think. We're not just having orgies and shooting up crystal meth and taking it up the ass all the time. There's conferences, there's intelligent things that we do. We contribute to society. I say that specifically because when I got kicked out of Lakewood Church in Houston, Texas for not being straight, once they found out, my MySpace page that I was hanging out in Montrose in the gay district in Houston, the lady from who was over the kids choir, I'll never forget her fucking words, that fucking cunt. And and I only use cunt if it's really warranted. And she's a fucking cunt. And as she was kicking me out, she was all like referring to the gay district of Houston. She was all like, "You can't be doing that, hanging out there with those people."
Oh, yeah.
I was like, Wait, wait, what the fuck you think we're doing? Oh, wait, you have never been. Okay." So,
And it's common here too, like with like particularly with the two-spirit community. A lot of that like stigma and shame that people experienced and learned from the residential school system is like now in our own communities. So the work that we're doing at Edmonton Two Spirit Society is really trying to reconnect to our own Indigenous communities, because the 2S LGBTQ community, they honor us, they respect us, they brought us in, right? Like we don't have to justify ourselves as much. People don't understand, so there's still a lot of learning that has to happen. But in Indigenous spaces, they're like, well, like these are new teachings. This two spirit doesn't even mean anything. It's a new term, and like those, you're just gay, you're just trans. Like, there's like almost like an alienation of us within our own Indigenous spaces. And that's like that whole residential school piece that's still coming from religion, really.
okay. So explain to me the difference in between Native American and Indigenous.
Yeah. So I don't use the term Native American, partially because the term American is a colonial word. The idea that America is these three separate areas, because I also include South America as part of the Americas, right? We use the term Turtle Island. And so Turtle Island is basically Canada, United States, and all the way down, like from the top to the tip. That's Turtle Island. And so we use that. There's stories and beliefs around that I'm not going to get into, very cultural stuff. But Turtle Island, the fact that we're from this land predates the people who came and brought the term America to us, right? And so here in Canada, a lot of people will say Native or Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, Inuit. They don't really use Native American up here, and I think that's that separation of Canada versus America, right? Like we don't see ourselves as American, we're Canadian. And so, for a lot of people, I can't speak for all Indigenous people, obviously. I'm one guy, like I'm just one person. But for me personally, that's how I perceive it, is that like I'm not from America, I'm from the land. I'm from this space. This is my home. And so I'm indigenous to this land. I'm from this land. This land is mine. And so I don't see myself as an American or a Canadian even. I'm Cree first and foremost. I'm Nihio. That's the Cree word. how we say it in my language, Nihio.
Here's the people who know exactly who the fuck they are. No, no question within your voice. You said that shit straight. I know who the fuck I am, motherfucker.
Don't get me wrong, like
Oh, yeah.
I'm so grateful that I grew up in Canada. Of all the places in the world, I didn't grow up knowing war. I didn't grow up knowing, like, I grew up in a home that like was very violent. I grew up with abuse and not having a lot of money, but I was never starving. I didn't have to struggle for water. Like, I don't have to. There's things that like that I'm privileged. I carry a lot of privilege being born in a country like Canada, and I honor that and I recognize that. But I also honor and recognize the flip side of that, that being Indigenous in Canada is meaning growing up in violence. That means you were born with grief because of the whole history, right? And we don't have a say in that. It wasn't my choice. It wasn't my decision to grow up with that pain and the violence in my family, right? And that's something that I'm actively working against to break that cycle and to live in what we say a good way. And yeah, so it's taken a long time to know who I am, and I'm still on that path. I'm still on that journey, but I can say with confidence, like, yeah, I'm Indigenous, and I'm proud of that. I own that.
So indigenous is the purest form because Native American has the American in it. And what I'm hearing you say is, well, we not American and we were here first. So indigenous is really the purest of the two.
Yeah, I don't know if purist, I don't know if that's the word that I would use, but for me personally, that's how and again, you might talk to a different Indigenous person, like especially in America, where they often refer themselves to as Indian. Like Indian is a word that's owned and used, and I don't personally understand why they use that. Particularly elders, I think, use that in the States. Here, that's like a slur. Like like the Indian Act, like it's literally a part of our history that is still controlling us, still defining us, right? So like I'm literally engulfed in Canadian politics just by being born, because I'm part of that document. My life is guided by that document, right? So Indian here has like a negative connotation. We don't typically use it. Native is like as a very common one, but I think Indigenous is more and more being used.
Okay. Tell me what does in between mean?
Yeah. So in between, for again, speaking from my own personal context, because I can't speak for all Two-Spirit people, and also recognizing that I'm not an elder or a knowledge carrier, the in between is just kind of how I've always seen myself. So we actually have 8 genders in my culture. And, one of those genders is the in between people, the Testiawinawak. And the Testiawinawak are a group of people who can like walk between men and women's worlds, but they're in the center of it. And so my whole life I was like, I don't feel like quite like a man. I don't feel quite like a woman. I didn't have terms for gender growing up. I always kind of knew I was like hella queer. Like I was bisexual at 14. Like, I was doing nothing. Now I identify as like, if I use a colonial term, it's more pansexual, right? But I never had language for gender growing up. And because I didn't grow up in my culture, our family was so impacted by the residential school system that we didn't grow up going to ceremony. We went to like powwows and round dances, but I didn't grow up on the land. I don't know how to hunt. I don't know how to I'm not a pipe carrier. I don't do any of these things. I'm just learning now. I'm just learning my traditional language now. But like historically, I've always felt like I'm just like in this in between space. I don't know how else to describe it. Like, and I was also adopted at a young age. So I was adopted by my biological mom's biological sister. So I was raised by my aunt and uncle, and that's where I love them. We've come past this now, but that's where a lot of the violence that I was raised with came from them. And so my whole life, I've been between my biological mom's family and my biological aunt's family. And I've always felt like that in between person. So when I started to go on this path of cultural reclamation and learning about my indigeneity from a Cree context, and I learned that there's a whole group of people that are honored for being in between of everything. And if you think of in a Cree culture, we honor the circle, right? There's the circle of life, the sun, the moon. We honor the circle, and so the in between person is kind of in the center of the circle, and it's not like a power thing. It's not like a privilege thing. It's just holding the balance, right? You need to have somebody there holding it all together. So that's kind of for me where it comes from, being part of the in between. But I think it really kind of, so other people might have different perspectives of that.
Okay. Thank you for that breakdown. The last definition I need from you is indigi-queer.
Yeah. Okay. So Indigiqueer is another one of those ones. So not all Indigenous Two-Spirit, or sorry, let me start again. Not all Indigenous people who identify as queer or trans are Two-Spirit. And not all two-spirit people identify as queer or trans, right? It really is a very personal process, and it really does depend on what your cultural teachings are and how you carry yourself. And so, Indigi-queer is another way of folks who maybe don't feel tied to that two-spirit term. Indigi-queer is a way of honoring their queerness and their indigeneity. So it's just the two terms put together. I often include trans folks and other gender diverse folks within that label of queer, but it doesn't always fit. So Indigi-queer and trans is kind of another thing. It's just colloquial language that we use when talking about, and I think it's just kind of fun to say Indigi-queer, like, oh yeah.
I'm thankful for all of the variety, so no one's left out and, new terms are being added all the time. And so the beauty in this variety is something conservative assholes will never understand because they don't have happiness residing inside their hearts.
Yeah, and that diversity I think is really beautiful. Like I say, when I learned that there were 8 genders in my culture, that like there's so much diversity in that alone in those teachings. It's really empowering and uplifting to know that diversity is honored in my culture. And as I was learning about like our indigenous language, I'm still very new in learning my language. But as I was learning Nihiawe the Cree language, I was asking about kinship terms because kinship and family is really important in our community. And so there's words for like mother and father that are similar to aunt and uncle, but there's also kinship terms for honoring diversity in relationships. There was like kinship terms for multiple partners. And as a polyamorous person, I'm like, even the diversity of how I love is honored in my language. And that's beautiful to me. So I love diversity and I'm so glad.
So the indigenous, culture doesn't is not, they embrace, various sexual expressions inherent.
Yeah. I mean, so I think like yeah, again, I can't speak for every nation because we're
Right.
not a monolithic group. And so
Right.
I can only speak from a Cree perspective and from my own personal learnings that I've received so far. But there is an individual, his name is Harlan Pruden. Highly recommend you look into his work. He's done a lot of research around language, indigenous languages around the world, not just in Turtle Island, but around the world that honors gender diversity. And there's over 130 unique terms for gender in different nations around the world. And that for me is like, again, beauty is that diversity has always been there. And I think even though that's talking more specifically about gender, I think we can look at it from a sexuality perspective as well. Because if you're in a particular gender role or filling a gender role in your community, but you're also representing as a different gender, right? Like if you're born male and you're presenting as female and living as a female, you're already engaging in sexuality practices depending on who your partner is, right? So it's a little complex. Like the whole idea of being two spirit isn't like cut and dry. A lot of people just expect like a really standard explanation, but it's really complicated and it really depends on what nation you're coming from. So again, I can't speak for all two spirit people or all sexualities or all genders, but that's my learnings as I've received it so far.
So you said your people, Cree, have 8 genders. Was that some of the ones we were just talking about?
Yeah, so I'm not going to go into too much cultural stuff because we have processes and what we call protocol for sharing deeper cultural traditions and practices and learnings. And so there needs to be a particular exchange of tobacco and intentions to be able to share some of those cultural teachings. So I'm not going to get into all of the genders. I'm not going to break it all down. But yes, there are 8 very specific genders, and in those genders are man and women as well. And each of those genders have their own teachings and their own rules and responsibilities in our society.
So you're saying like I would have to be engrafted into your culture in order to gain this knowledge? Do y'all take in different people at times? They have to be born into it, or how does that work?
Yeah. So being two spirit is like by us for us. Like if you're not indigenous, you cannot be two spirit. There's other names and ways of living and being and knowing that you can take claim to. So if you're not indigenous, please don't take claim to being two spirit. If you are indigenous, we encourage you to reconnect to your own like so you said you have some indigeneity in you, finding out what your tribe is or your nation that you are coming from and then connecting with them. But in my culture, if somebody like comes in a good way and brings tobacco and wants to sit with me and learn with me, I'll share what I know. As long as I know that they're not going to take that for profit, they're not going to go and try and teach those teachings to other people. If they're there just to learn and engage, then that's like a reciprocal relationship, right? they've offered tobacco, they've shown me they have good intentions, and they're not just going to take these teachings and then try to share it with the whole world, right? So just because you're being shared cultural teachings doesn't mean that it's yours to then use however you wish.
I would be afraid of the bad karma that would come upon me if I wouldn't go in black. I could feel something bad would happen to somebody if they were to dishonor the agreement. Um,
Yeah, I think that would be between them and creator.
don't do it, y'all. If you get somebody fuck up about it, don't tell nobody that your significant other. Just keep it to yourself. So, but do you verify the person's identity, check their background to be sure before you share or anything like that, or do you just kind of go on how you vibe and how you feel about them?
Yeah, again, recognizing that I'm not an elder and I'm not a knowledge carrier, so I'm not like engaging some of these deeper cultural teachings that I'm giving to other people yet. But I do get a lot of people coming to me just because of my role at the Edmonton Two-Spirit Society as the community liaison who does community education and holds ceremony. I do get people coming to me, and usually you can feel it out. Like if somebody's like Pride Month next month is in June in Canada is Indigenous History Month and Pride Month. So it's both. So it's like our month next month, just saying. But that's a month where you can really weed out who's there to check up a checklist and who's there to actually meaningfully and willingly learn from you and grow with you. Um, it kind of is a vibe thing, I guess. But there's a big issue right now here in Canada of what we're calling pretendians. So non-Indigenous people who are claiming indigeneity and then entering into spaces and like entering into like politics, entering into academia to the entertainment industry even and feigning being indigenous and receiving power and privilege based off of that claim. They're starting to be found out. There's more and more people who are coming out now like, no, that's what we're calling a pretendian. They're not actually really indigenous. So I don't believe in blood quantum being like how much indigenous of your, how much, what percentage of your blood is indigenous. But if you can show like, hey, this is the nation that I come from and I didn't grow up there, but here's how I'm engaging with my community. And here's the questions I have. Like for me, if you went to my reserve, they're not going to know who I am because I didn't grow up there. Right. But I'm doing everything I can here in Edmonton to re-engage with elders and ceremony and learn in a good way. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, a bit of a convoluted way of answering it, but again, it is individual specific and you can, but I think you can tell when someone's coming with bad intentions or someone's coming with like, capitalistic intentions. You can feel that sort of thing, but with the amount of pretendians that are being found in our communities, maybe it's not so easy to tell. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you for bearing with me, as you're overcoming COVID. We have one more thing to talk about before we wrap.
Yeah, no worries. I'm enjoying the conversation.
I appreciate it. I am too. I'm gonna be sad when this one's over. So let's talk about media underrepresentation for Indigenous peoples. I read this article probably on LGBTQ Nation or Queerty. One of them, I think, is where I got this article from. And it's about a model. I hope I don't mess up her name. I think it's
Wanna chasing horse, yeah.
Quanah Chasing Horse. And when I read this, as I'm thinking about it today, it's reminding me of like how down here in the States, they'll get these white people to play roles that are not white. So you have a white person playing like a samurai in an Asian movie, or a white person playing an indigenous person in like,
Beltran playing Chakotay in Voyager. Sorry, little Star Trek nerd there.
like white people. I mean, you're exactly right. Like these white people are like shapeshifters who they can play anything. They could play Jesus. Jesus was from the Middle East. He wasn't fucking white. There should never have been a white-haired, blue-eyed Jesus. Never,
Yeah.
ever. No, white people do not come from the Middle East. And so this idea that white people can just take over anything and it's presented to the masses like we're supposed to accept it without question. Okay, speak so much against whitey. I know not all white people are assholes. I know a lot of white people who cannot stand their families. They're like, my family is fucking racist. I fucking can't stand them. They're just like shit and they make us all look bad. So I know it's not all of you white people, but goddamn, it's a lot of you who are just hateful assholes. And so in terms of media, what happened with this with this girl here, besides of her own personal issues that she goes into great detail in this article, she she works with designers and everything like that who support Indigenous people and sustainability. And she said when she was growing up, she didn't feel represented in mainstream media. So that made her not think she was pretty because she never saw someone with her like same face on the television. So speak to me about how this has affected your community because, it took us a while to just start getting black people in a lot of movies, but there were no indigenous people. How did that make y'all feel left out? How did it affect you?
Yeah, growing up, because I was growing up in, in like an urban setting, I didn't grow up on the reserve. I didn't grow up around my culture, but I knew I was Indigenous, right? But like, as I said, I don't know my biological dad. So there's a whole like part of my cultural identity that's just like, I don't take claim to generic whiteness. And white for me is like capital white TM. Like when you get those really hateful, you know, those people that you were just describing, that's like, it's like a certain subsection of white people. Anyways, I digress. When I was growing up, I never saw myself on TV. I never saw myself represented in media. And it's only been honestly in the last couple of years as a two-spirit queer Indigenous person that I've seen myself in the media. And I can honestly say I think I have 3 representations of myself in the media. That's it. And that's not a lot. And 2 of them are from reality shows. So they're actually, The Amazing Race Canada, Dr. James Makokis and his husband, Anthony Johnson, good friends of mine, they won The Amazing Race. And that was the first time we saw Indigenous people in a reality show like that. And then there's Ilona Verley, seeing Ilona Verley on Canada's Drag Race. That was the first two-spirit Indigenous person to be on Drag Race. That was the first time I ever saw, and as a drag artist now, I do drag myself. Tugs Cucina on Instagram. We'll just drop that there. When I started doing drag, it was like I could turn to Ilona as being one of the only representations in mass media, in mainstream media of two-spirit people, right? So like it is complicated and it is difficult. And it's hard to see yourself as being a valid person when all of your media is whitewashed, right? And now again, we're seeing a little bit more of that diversity, more Indigenous casting. If you haven't heard of the show Reservation Dogs, I really recommend you check it out. It's a really wonderful show about an Indigenous group of youth, and now we can see ourselves. My youth that I work with in community can watch that show and see somebody who's from Alberta and see the way she talks and see the way she looks and be like, that person looks like me. And so I think it's important not just within a media context, but in representation all across the board. Representation in politics. We have Blake Desjardins. He's a two-spirit member of parliament, the very first two-spirit person to be in that position in Canada. So seeing ourselves even in politics now, I see myself in the parliamentary building. And that's something that never happened before. So I think representation is really important. I think kids deserve to see that they're valid, that they belong to different spaces that aren't just Indigenous, that we can integrate into mainstream society while still walking in our cultural path, right? And there's a term called two-eyed seeing, and it's a term by, I think it's Albert Marshall that developed the term. And it's the idea of walking within a Western world while also holding on to Indigenous knowledges and ways of being and knowing, and find a balance of the two and seeing the world through both of these lenses. And I think that's representation in a nutshell, right? We need to be able to see ourselves. We need to be able to represent ourselves and honor that. So more and more it's happening. It's great to see people on TV, great to see representations of Indigenous people that aren't stereotypes, right? Because that's the other thing is when we do see ourselves on TV, it's a very like, hey, ho, how, like there, it's just like, even on Star Trek, I'm a huge Star Trek nerd. I love Star Trek, but Star Trek worked with one of those pretendians, worked with a person who pretended to be Indigenous. And if you watch Voyager, that whole show is like really bad stereotypical representation of indigeneity. And that's how we see ourselves on TV, right? Like that's like historically, like that's not fun or kind or uplifting or empowering, right? It's just like I don't see myself in that person. So I think representation is really important. I'm really proud of people like Juana. I'm really proud of these folks who are breaking down barriers and saying, fuck your beauty standards. I'm gorgeous. And she's got her traditional tattoos on her face. She's rocking her indigeneity on her face. And now there's people like trying to make replicas of like attachments that they can put on their chin. like so that they can imitate her indigeneity, which is wrong. You shouldn't be like that's cultural, that's ceremonial for her. She might have gone through a process to receive the teachings around that tattoo. It's a very personal thing that she did to be able to get that tattoo on her face. And so for someone to then create a replica of it without understanding the cultural meaning of it, right? So that's the other side of representation that we're now going to have to deal with is people then taking aesthetically our cultures and our ceremonies and using it how they want. So is representation always good? Not necessarily. There's a certain amount of education and learning that needs to come along with that representation. So people like Juana have an opportunity to engage the world in this learning. And I'm proud of her. I hope she kicks everybody's butt out there. She's beautiful. Wish we could all be that beautiful.
He is beautiful. And I heard you say you did drag, so be sure that you email me your social media
Yeah.
so that I could include that in the show notes.
I'm a newbie drag performer. I just started doing drag last year, but I mentioned Alona Verley, and I get to open for Alona next month, and I'm really excited. I got to perform alongside her, and so seeing her on TV and then getting into drag myself and being like, this is a person that I can look up to who's used a professional platform. Yeah, really cool. So yeah, Tugs Cucina is my drag name.
Yeah, send me that information and I will put it in the show notes and we'll do what we can. So then the last thing I want you to just explain to us is what the Edmonton Two Spirit Society is. Tell us about your website. Just who do you work for?
Yeah. Well, the Edmonton Two-Spirit Society is what we call an intergenerational organization. And what that means is there were working groups in our city that laid a foundation of the work that we're doing now. So what we do is we work with Two-Spirit and other Indigenous, queer, and trans folks, the folks who are questioning. Primarily, that's the folks that we work with of all ages. We work from 0 to any age, really. And our whole goal is to help Two-Spirit people reintegrate back into Indigenous communities, but also into contemporary society. We really want to see Indigenous people have an opportunity to reignite their passion for their cultural language, to basically have connection to culture, ceremony, and also to have connection to a community of other like-minded individuals. So we kind of do a lot. We're a very small organization. Right now, there's only two of us, actually. It's the executive director and then myself. And I do a little bit of everything. So I help run our membership. We have like registered members and then we have non-registered members that we work with. We we set up ceremonies. We set up like social activities. I do suicide and crisis intervention. I do referrals for mental health support. I do harm reduction support for a local organization. We offer elders, connection to elders. We also offer community education. So we go into schools, organizations, businesses, and teach all about what it is to be Two-Spirit and kind of share some of this knowledge that I've shared with you. We do inclusivity training, that sort of thing, talk about decolonization. So really just trying to connect Two-Spirit people, but also non-Two-Spirit people to these teachings and to this understanding. So we kind of do a lot. Yeah, that's a little bit about us. We are only in our second year of funding, so we're quite a small new organization. We're still figuring ourselves out. We are currently unhoused. We don't currently have an office, which is kind of a big issue for us at the moment. We are looking for a space that will allow us to be able to do ceremony in it and lift the pipe and bring people in a safe, good way. And we just haven't found a spot for that yet. So we're on the hunt for a new home. But we do have our website, e2s.ca. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and it's just Edmonton Two-Spirit Society. And yeah, if folks have questions or comments, concerns, if they're looking to connect to other Two-Spirit communities, there's a few Two-Spirit communities in the States. So we can also help connect folks to somebody in their area, or maybe even help folks figure out how to set up a Two-Spirit space in their community as well. That's kind of our long-term goal, is helping set up more Two-Spirit hubs in Northern Canada. So Edmonton Two-Spirit Society is the most northern organization in the whole world. And we serve everybody from Edmonton up, basically. And so it's a lot of work. There's a lot of individuals out there who aren't receiving services. And so we're hoping to kind of fill that gap until they can set something up in their own community. So a little bit of a long-winded answer about who we are, but essentially we are just really trying to make sure that Indigenous folks know that they're loved, and that they have a space in our circle, that they're welcomed, that they're valid, and that we're going to be here for them as much as we can. So
Amen and amen to that. Well, do you have any last words you'd like to say to the world, to the United States, to Canada, to Edmonton? And you can say whatever you want to say.
My biggest thing is like really just take the time to get to know the people who are around you. Don't take claim to something that's not yours. Hold space for people who need it. Check in on your two spirit friends and relatives. It's hard out there for everybody, not just for queer and trans people, but it's hard out there right now for literally everybody. So just like show some kindness to each other and to yourselves. And remember that Two Spirit is biased for us. So please don't take claim to something that is not culturally something that is okay for you to take claim to. If that makes sense. And live long and prosper.
Hallelujah, tabernacle and praise. We've enjoyed the lovely Miss Cheyenne Mihko Kihêw, and we will look forward to the release of this episode. Thank you for your time and for your spirit, and I respect you and I respect your people greatly.
Kinanashkomitinawao, that's a Cree verb that means I am grateful to you all. Kinanashkomitin, I'm grateful to you. Hi, thank you.
Thank you all so much for taking time to listen to the Sex, Drugs, and Jesus podcast. It really means everything to me. Look, if you love the show, you can find more information and resources at sexdrugsandjesus.com or wherever you listen to your podcast. Feel free to reach out to me directly at Devannon at sexdrugsandjesus.com and on Twitter and Facebook as well. My name is Devannon, and it's been wonderful being your host today. And just remember that everything is going to be all right.